Hi, Andrew. Listen, thank you so much for coming along and having a conversation today. And what we've agreed to do, I think, is for you to bring along a lesson that you taught recently, and to have it as a reflective conversation. So a good opportunity for you to think about that lesson you taught, what you're happy with, what you would have liked to have improved, and then to pick up a few learning points for yourself to take it out of this conversation. And because I didn't watch the lesson, obviously I'm not going to have a view, but I'm going to help you with your own reflective
Yeah,
thoughts. How's that sound?
that sounds good. Yeah.
And what would you like to get out of it? If we whiz forward 15, 20, 25 minutes and we've talked about this, where would you like to be from having talked it through?
Um, Maybe feeling positive about what went well. We sometimes forget about that part, don't we? And we sometimes just go straight to the even better ifs. But yeah, reflecting on what went well and maybe why.
Yeah.
Uh, but also thinking about how I might incorporate what did go well into future planning.
Okay. Okay. So it wants to, you want to remember what went well, but you also want to influence future planning, future things you're going to do.
Yeah, I think
Right,
so.
okay. All right. So before we get into your own evaluation, just give me a 30 second, a minute flavor of what was a lesson and perhaps why you chose this lesson to talk about.
Um, So the lesson was a poetry lesson. It's a poem from one of the 15 poems that the year 11s have to study. Um, it's probably my favorite of the 15. So I probably know it, one of the best I know out of the 15 poems. And I decided to teach it as if it were an unseen poem, which is another part of the exam that they have to do. They have to, as part of the literature course, they have to write about two poems they've never seen before in exam conditions. So I decided to use this poem that they will know going into the exam, but use it fresh, that they've never seen that before. So we studied it as an unseen poem
Yeah.
before studying it as a seen poem that they will then be able to revise.
Okay. Okay. And is that the first time you've done that with that particular approach, or is it something you've tried before?
Um, I think I don't think I've tried it many times before. It doesn't feel like part of my common practice
Yeah.
at this stage. So I knew I was coming on to unseen poetry next, so I decided to maybe kill two birds with one stone by introducing it this way.
Okay. And that's such a teacher thing to do, isn't it? To think, well, I could achieve two things in
Yeah.
one lesson. Is that quite common, typical for you?
Yeah, time's tight
Yeah.
all the time. There's so much to get through, and so you're always thinking about doing things in the most efficient way.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, fine. Okay. So thank you for that, and that's helpful because I can have a bit of an idea about it. Let's talk about overall the strength. So give us a flavor of overall what were you happy with when you left the lesson or the students walked out. What was the overall feeling of that went well? What bits?
I was really pleased with the level of autonomy I gave them. It really did feel like it was a lesson where I facilitated rather than taught.
Yeah.
And one of my main areas for development is to try and make sure, personally as a teacher, to say a little bit less. Uh, um, and I think in this lesson, I very much allowed them to, yeah, to do more, to reflect more. And I think the outcome was pretty strong in terms of they came away with some really tangible ideas.
Mm.
Um, and I suppose the reason why maybe that happened is because they had I couldn't offer them any insight into the poem
Yeah.
because that's unrealistic for when they have to encounter a poem in an exam, which they haven't seen before. There's no point in me teaching it to them. I will in my next lesson. I am going to now then teach it to them, and that will get them to compare what their reflections were the first time of seeing it, and now what I would want them to revise when they have it as a known poem. But yeah, so because it was a poem that I was preparing them for the skill of approaching any poem,
Mm.
there was no point in me giving them any sort of any guidance. So I was really pleased with the level of sort of autonomy and independence that they demonstrated in the lesson.
Okay, fab. So you've got like a benchmark, haven't you? A headline of you were able to achieve something that you were particularly interested. Fab. Well, let's get into the detail. And I was thinking there may be other ones, but I was thinking if we think about like what you did, if we think about the content and the material and how that was handled, and if we think about then the students and their engagement and involvement, and you've already started talking about that one. Do they sound like useful three areas to
Yeah.
focus on? So let's see what you did. You said that you wanted to talk less, facilitate more, have them develop their thinking rather than, as you said, teach them. So less
Mm.
teacher talk time. So what did you do? What did you do in the positive way to achieve those things?
Um, I gave them plenty of thinking time.
Mm,
I made sure that before I gave them the poem and said, first thing I want you to do is I want you to just read it without writing any notes. I just want you to get a sense of what's happening in the poem.
mm,
Um, and then I asked them to read it again, and this time read it with the view of the question focus. It was a poem, it's a war poem, I asked, and the question focus was generally it was feelings about war. And so go through with a highlighter, and this time highlight all the details within the poem which you feel could be relevant to that question. And then I asked them to read it again, and this time with a pen, so they could start to make notes as to what feelings were emerging. So I suppose the key there is, and that's something I don't always do.
mm,
I might ask them to read a poem first quietly to themselves,
mm.
but then I'll probably read it with them the second time. Whereas this time I didn't read it to them at all. And that's partly because of the fact that I'm preparing them for the unseen poetry part of the exam where there's not going to be a teacher reading it to them. Um, but I think maybe in hindsight, it's something that I could probably apply to all poetry study in the future. Um, time is always of the essence, but actually, I think I'm building their confidence a little bit more by giving them more independence and giving them more time to reflect on a poem and bring something more of it to themselves from themselves. So I think I would probably do that. And I know that's not necessarily what you asked me, but I'm already thinking now, why don't I do that more often? That for the sake of 3 or 4 minutes of a lesson, actually just encourage them to read something 3 times is probably a, an easy thing to incorporate into any poetry lesson.
Okay, and it's fab, isn't it? You're already getting some ideas and some takeaways coming out the other end. I was curious that this approach that you developed, is it something, did you think about it before the lesson? Yeah, I'm going to do it that way. Did it occur to you spontaneously? Is it something that you've come across before? So that's three questions in one, but I suppose I'm asking, how did it come about that you did that particular thing?
The three readings thing, it was probably a bit more spontaneous. Um, the poem I'd chosen, using that as the basis for doing unseen poetry, that was obviously pre-planned, and I knew what I wanted to get through. But at the end of it, I wanted them to come away mainly with three feelings within the poem that they detected that the speaker had about war.
Yeah.
So I suppose I had a little bit of freedom within the middle as to how I was going to get there, knowing that that was a realistic outcome for like a 45, 50 minute lesson. So I think the three readings thing, I probably looked at the clock and thought, I've got a little bit more time here. We'll go again. I knew I wanted them to read it through independently to themselves, but probably wouldn't have asked them to read it through another 2 times.
Yeah.
So I thought on the spot a little bit and thought, okay, the second time they can do it this way, and the third time they're going to do it that way. So that was a little bit more instinctive, I think.
Okay, great, great. And do you feel comfortable with that? Being on your pins and being able to work those type of things out.
Yeah, I think I've been doing it quite a while now, I suppose, and with that poem in particular, that's not an unknown. That I know that poem, so I know what's achievable with that. So there were a lot of knowns, and I knew the time I had, and I thought, right, okay, I've got a bit of flexibility here. And if it doesn't go well this lesson, then I've got a bit of time to make up. So all the sort of the context allowed for it, yeah.
Okay, okay, fine. All right. So we put one bit of your, if you like, your teacher actions under the spotlight a bit, this setup stage that you've talked about. Anything else you want to talk about what you did that you were happy with?
Um, yeah, I think when I encouraged them to well, after the three readings. No, actually, but maybe the first thing is being disciplined with the three readings and just sort of giving them a set amount of time. We use timers quite a lot. It's part of our practice, little sort of stopwatches in the classroom, and being disciplined to stick with that and not say anything and hold back. That's when you know the poem so well and you want to make sure they get the best out of it. Um, I think that was probably something I'm quite pleased with. I held back and did and saw the benefit of me saying nothing
Mm.
and held sort of had faith that that would be the right course of action.
And were you biting your tongue, or were you sitting there as calm as you like in the corner?
I think I was probably I did feel quite calm. I think yeah. I think I felt more and more calm
Mm.
the more I saw them arriving at it independently and coming up with their own ideas.
Yes.
I'll be honest, I think we'll come on to this, but there's an area for development in terms of how much I reviewed what they were doing,
Yes.
and that's something to think about going forward. But they were all writing something, and there's a win there because they'd never seen that poem before, so they had the confidence to offer something. So that, yeah. So I felt as that went on, I saw more and more of them writing something and having something to offer. That made me feel a bit calmer that it was the right course of action.
Okay, so the holding back and you're watching and you're observing. Fab. Okay. And if there was one last thing that you want to mention about like you and your specific things in your practice that you're doing in that lesson that you're happy with, what would they be?
I think that the last thing I probably came to is like I gave them like a bit of a sort of a checklist, which I kind of formed prior to the lesson, the things that they should look for. It's a bit of like a what's the word? Like a lifeline, if you like. So if you're struggling with a poem and you don't know where to start with these things. Well, what is every poem going to have? It's always going to have a title. 99% of the time, it's going to have a title. If it hasn't got a title, that could be a point of interest. So we could think about the title. Every poem is going to have an opening. Every poem is going to have an ending. So we went through a list of things and I arrived at about 4 or 5 things that they could use as a way in if they were really struggling to get under the skin of this poem. And I think they seem to respond to that quite well as well, having that bit of a sort of a generic checklist that can be applicable to any poem.
Yes. Okay, fab. And that leads us nicely on to, I suppose, the next bit, the resources or the content or the materials or how well what you are providing for them to work with in the lesson. So let's put a bit of focus on that. What were you happy with in terms of the resources and the materials and the structure and the information?
I mean, I, I was happy with the simplicity of it because it was literally just a photocopied poem from their book of poetry. So they all have one of these,
Yeah.
and the poem is in this. And because we haven't annotated it together yet, it's blank, so I just photocopied that. They'll bring in their own copy next time, and then they can update their own copy of the poem next time with their own notes and what we do together as a class. But in terms of resources, that was it really. It was just a blank sort of an annotated copy of a poem. So I suppose what's good about that is it was a very simple thing to prepare. It didn't, and we're not really a school or an English department that goes in for sort of lots of complicated and jazzy resources. It's trying to keep it simple, simple but effective. So yeah, it's easily sort of repeatable from that point of view.
Okay, and I can't not ask you because you did say it was your favorite poem of the war poems. So, and I don't know which one was it. Which is
Yeah,
it?
it's a poem called "Remains" by Simon Armitage.
Yeah.
You've probably heard of Simon Armitage. It's he's done a series of poems, and this one on war, and this one is exploring a real life soldier's um, experience
Mm.
that he's turned into a poem, which unpicks a lot about PTSD.
Yes. 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 I'm saying yes because I think my daughter did it for GCSE this summer,
Yeah,
so I think
probably. Yeah,
I may
yeah,
well have seen it. Goodness.
yeah.
All right, so that's the resources and it seems quite straightforward and something you're happy with and comfortable with. Let's talk about the student engagement then. You've already said a few things about what you've noticed and you've seen about them responding to the thinking time and the right read it 3 times. What else were you happy with through the whole lesson about the students, how they were managing?
I suppose the thing that I came away really being pleased about was more about the individuals and how I saw certain students in the class really giving it their all and
Yeah.
almost chomping at the bit and going a little bit too far, not too far. I didn't want to hold them back, but when I said, like, "Oh, just read it through now, don't make any notes," some of them were making notes. And like, okay, well, you're not following the instruction, but actually, that's quite nice that you're
Yeah.
already feeling there's an appetite. You've got something you can contribute already. And that one student, it's a girl who's been a bit of a sort of a quiet performer for the first part of the GCSE, but she came away with so many insights, and it
Yeah.
was kind of um, representative of how she's come on a lot recently as well. So that was a real joy actually to see she was there, and I was thinking, crikey, you're doing really well there. And looking over her shoulder and seeing some of what she was writing, that was really nice to see.
So you're pleased that one of your students didn't follow your instructions.
Yeah,
But
one out of the
then
32
produce extra
did really
work, right?
well.
Uh, I'm
And she
teasing.
didn't follow She did it her own way. She didn't need me. She did it better.
Fab. Well, there you are. But you're facilitating some learning, right? And so
Yeah.
there's a bit of agency and autonomy that's important. Okay. What
Yeah.
else? What else are you really happy with what the students were doing?
Um, Counter to that, I was really pleased with that. They just sort of they followed the instructions, they followed the process, and they trusted in the process.
Mm.
Um, it's our second year together now, and so we've got a good relationship, I would say. And they they all bought into it. They were all giving it a go, and there was no hesitancy. There was no, I don't know. The killer response is, to any question, I don't know. Because in an English classroom, we're often saying, I'm not expecting you to know. I'm
Yeah.
expecting you just to have a go. And they all had a go. No one was sort of putting the barriers up.
Okay. And thank you. And if I'm going to ask a proper, exam-based question, like in terms of progress in this lesson on what you needed them to achieve, getting prepared for this bit of the English exam, did they make as much progress as you needed them to make?
I think so. Particularly it was because it wasn't really at that in that sort of that meaty stage of intensive exam practice, have a go at doing this for 20 minutes or so. It was more of an introduction to it. And what I wanted them to get out of it is to come at it and think, right, I might have to write about a poem I've never seen before, but it's achievable. And
Yes.
and there's no, I don't have to understand the whole poem. So I always say to them, you don't have to write about the whole poem here. You won't have time to. I just want you to come away with being able to say three quality things about it. And I feel like we arrived at that. Yeah.
Fab. Okay. So we've spent just over quarter of an hour talking about something that you did well, that you were happy with in a lesson. Can you remember the last time I'm not saying you don't do very good lessons, but can you remember the last time you just focused on what you did well for that period of time?
No, not at all.
Okay.
No.
So what are you taking away? What are you taking away from the first half of our conversation?
Um, the impact of the simplicity of it.
Mm.
Um, and the the fact that you can think on your feet, and sometimes that generates some of the best parts of a lesson.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and just reflecting on, I don't suppose I'd reflected. I said about that one student, but actually, as a class, I hadn't reflected on and spent some time being pleased about how well they'd all engaged.
Yes. Ah, thank you. Well, thank you for that. And it's wonderful to see how much you are reflecting and how much you're really thinking about this. So we do need to talk about the areas of development, but let's not let them bleed into the positivity of what you've got, and presumably you've chosen this lesson because you're interested in some areas of development as well, how you can
Yeah,
expand this. So I won't go into those three subtopics that you choose. Now, which of the areas of development you think, if you could run that lesson again, you'd keep all those good bits, but you'd change what, or you'd add in what, or take away what?
I think it's. I suppose it's more about how I can almost codify it
Yeah.
and capture everything about that and just run it again with that class. Go back to what link back to what we've done in a previous lesson. Um, Recapture that, but also in future years, in a year's time with my current year 10s when I'm teaching them in year 11. To remind myself to teach that lesson again, but to teach it better with maybe better the resources, for example. Now I've done it. Actually, what that needs is maybe a PowerPoint slide or something just to capture it, something to print out for them so they can stick into their book so they've got it. Because at the moment it was fairly organic,
Mm.
and I think the danger is that I lose the power of that by not making it a bit more concrete.
Okay. Okay. And concrete means a little bit more resource.
Yeah.
Does it mean anything else, the concrete?
Um, I think, like I said, a resource, but also a reflection on the 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 checklist, for example. I asked them the generic checklist. Did I include everything I could have included there? Is there anything else I could add to that? I don't want to give them too much because I think a list of 10 is unrealistic. I try to keep it almost try and keep things on one hand.
Mm.
Like so five things we can do, five things we can look for. Did I choose the best five? But yesterday it was fine, but are those the best five that could apply to any poem? Are there better ones which could be even more universal in terms of the individual features to look for?
Okay. So if you're here trying to codify things and make templates, is that some work you need to do?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is it work you need to do by what? Talking to colleagues or looking things up or how can you identify
I
that?
think starting with just distilling my own thoughts and writing down what I did yesterday and what was the out what I ended up doing in the lesson, even though I went in with a plan, what I tweaked it to, and then probably taking that to a colleague and saying, okay, this is because I know I've got a colleague of mine who does something similar, and this is the first time I'd done it, and just checking in with her and saying, okay, I know you do this. You ask them to think about the poem from in these different lenses. Is this kind of the thing that you do? Is there anything you think I'm missing? How do these look? So a bit of a sharing of practice there, I think.
Okay, okay. And you talked about saying trying to have one like consistent resource and which are the best questions. Does it have to be one singular version or can it be more like there's three or four or five depending on the year group and the poem and the whatever? Or is it there will be a one?
I think it probably would be a one, but your point about different year groups. I only really teach GCSE, so but I can imagine this is something you could differentiate down.
Mm,
But for me, for my purpose, it would probably be one. So they can literally on the morning of the exam, my thinking is we would say, okay, so what are the five things we're looking for any poem? And they would literally be able to reel them off. And I think because there's so many other components in that one exam, there's two other texts that they have to study. So they'll be to reduce the cognitive load, just one universal checklist probably would be the way I'd go about it.
okay, great. Okay, so you've got a wider plan than simply make this lesson rerun better. It could actually influence exam work for them.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, cool. Anything else, or what else have you got? Like you think if you reran the lesson, you would do differently, or next time you run the
Yeah, I
lesson?
think the main thing, and this is probably a little bit of a sort of a constant work in progress for me. My what we call live marking, getting the right, and not I don't mean sort of marking, but reviewing the progress a little bit more forensically. I tend to spend a lot of time walking around the classroom checking on progress, but I think yesterday was checking engagement. And if I were to do it again, I'd want to check in engagement and quality.
Mm,
Was what they were saying meaningful? Now, I wasn't looking for them to get to a right answer because, as I say, I don't want them to think that in an unseen poem there's only one way of interpreting it because that could just cause them to put the blockers up. But I think I could have interrogated their responses on their paper a little bit more to check whether they were coming up with reasonable interpretations and they just weren't writing anything down just to look like they were. I don't think they were, but I don't know they would. So I
yeah.
would want to be a little bit more forensic and a little bit tighter with that sort of reviewing process, I think.
Okay. And in the moment, were you aware of that, or is it something that now you're talking about it that it's more evident?
It did come to mind and I thought like you've spent a long time at the front of the class here looking at these guys, which is where that one student was. But I was conscious, and I'm not, this is a bit of a rarity. I would say I do get around the classroom quite a lot, but in that lesson, I think I could have circulated and reviewed a little bit more comprehensively.
Yes.
But as I say, it is something I'm conscious of. Often checking engagement, but maybe because of eyesight and handwriting, it's not always easy to check
Yeah.
quality as well over shoulders. So I've got to get better at that.
Okay. And is that something that would bleed into other lessons that you teach?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
okay. So if we are going to take a wider learning for you then from that, like what would be some thoughts about how that can be developed, as well as all these other many things you need to do in a lesson, right?
I think probably some of the things I've often told other teachers to do to make it easier for myself, either standard, what we call like standardize the form. In other words, make it really easy to check whether what they're doing is the right thing
Yeah.
by getting them to write it in a certain way, or other things like I could ask them to use a highlighter so they highlight what you feel is your best observation.
Yeah.
And so then my eye is instantly drawn, so I don't have to decipher page of notes. I can actually just focus on the one thing. And that's probably something I would remind myself to do, which I think I've probably forgotten.
Where would life be without the highlighter pen, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
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 All right. So if we take these things that you've brought out, if you take out the idea of generally replicating the lesson, specifically coming up with this idea of the template checklist to help your students do this type of lesson better, but also exam practice, and you having more time and checking the quality of the work and not just the engagement. If you could achieve these on a more regular, consistent basis, what do you think it might mean for you and for the students?
Gosh, I mean, for me, greater understanding of them, for them, more purposeful feedback,
Yes.
probably, and also with regard to the codifying of things, more confidence and clarity of what they're going for, because we keep on coming back to the same strategy each time, and it's just then embedded.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Okay. So there's something significant for them and for you. Fab.
Mm.
Is that enough? Is there any other dark corners of areas of development, or do you think we've encapsulated enough to be able to have you stuff of substance to do?
No, I think the observation is maybe for me to take away now, knowing where it went really, really well is it's really pleasing with that one student in particular. There were 31 others, and I'm not saying I ignored the others, but I suppose to really come away from it confidently and in a better place, I would at least like to have known, but where didn't it go so well? So who is the target for next time for
Yes.
me to sort of support a little bit more? And so maybe going forward, yeah, brilliant, celebrate that success, but where's the other end of the spectrum and where do you need to go next time?
Fab. Okay, thank you. So let's bring this conversation to a close and make sure that, as you would have done with your students, that there's meaningful things taken away. So from this, what are your, you've been scribbling away quite a lot. What are the things that you're going to do on the basis of today's conversation?
So I'm going to go away and just jot up the thoughts on a PowerPoint so they can sort of reflect on that together. But before I then reflect on that with the students and remind them what we did in our previous lesson and how we developed this checklist, I'm going to share that with a colleague, see whether there's anything I'm missing. If I think there's something else I need to add that in, and then use that going forward when we go on to study other unseen poems.
Mm,
I'm also going to, with the next two poems we study, because we only got two poems left to study, we're going to do the three readings again. I'm going to repeat that with them. And then I think also with regard to reviewing progress, I'm going to make sure they're using their highlighter a little bit more so they can show me where they feel they're most confident. So I can quickly get a snapshot of where they say their best is.
yes. Okay. So and measuring all of that, like if we go forward to, dare I say, the end of the academic year, we're talking now in December, aren't we? So if you go to June, July, what would you like to have seen from these things you're taking?
I suppose going into August, I'd like to see some impact in the results of the unseen poetry question.
I'll bet you
Uh,
would.
but I think going into June, May, June time when they go into their exam, I think it would be evident in terms of for that question, they don't feel fazed by what is potentially one of the hardest questions that they'll have to do. They know in that, okay, anything could come up, but I've got a strategy.
Yes. And what would you like to see in you, like generally in your practice come June?
Habit,
Yeah.
that this has become a habit and this is something that I'll use again next year.
Great. Okay, fab. Thank you. And we spent half an hour on this, and I didn't see your lesson, so I can't share a view. I can guess and imagine that these things you say, I could visualize that, but I haven't got a view. But you have shared really openly and deeply, and thank you for that. So at the end of this conversation, how are you feeling that you've talked all this through?
Yeah, I mean, just really really grateful for the time, the opportunity to reflect. It's not something, we try and do a lot of it here, but there's no limit to how much time you can reflect. And I just feel I've got a clear plan. After one, I mean, that's just one lesson. I've got a lot to think about after that one lesson, and I've got some actions to take away after one lesson only. So just if I could do that after every lesson, it'd be really beneficial.
Well, all you have to do is say to the head, I need an hour off after every
After every
lesson so that
lesson.
and we just introduce it across the board.
I mean,
Everybody
well,
be happy. Yeah,
there's
yeah.
not going to be a problem with that, is there?
Not at all, not at all. Well, listen, thank you so much, Andrew. I mean, I'd like to offer, appreciation and evaluation and all of that of your lesson, but I didn't see your lesson, but I can certainly appreciate like your openness and your sharing and all of this, and I hope you found it a rich conversation. And yeah, let's chat about this again. It'd be great to hear at the fag end of the year, what it was like and how these things went. So thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. Really appreciate that.